Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We are going to start our next plenary session. This is a packed day, I realize. And it's my honor to moderate this panel or this plenary session about bridging cultures. So we talked earlier today about all the things that unite the LLMs who come here. Their ambition, their intellect, their dedication, their wish to aim higher. But there are also some differences in a cohort of close to 200 students from all over the world. And what we want to talk about here today is the ways that these differences are or were relevant in the LLM years and how the experience during time here has shaped people's careers and thinking going forward. With me today are four wonderful panelists. One couldn't make it because of the hurricane, so we're gonna miss Roland, but we have four other wonderful panelists. I'm gonna introduce them very briefly. You have more on their bios in the booklet. So going alphabetically, Helena Alviar García, LL.M 97, S.J.D 01, is a Colombian academic, a leading scholar of law and development, property law, social and economic rights, feminism and transitional justice, a former professor and dean of Los Andes Law School in Colombia. She's now a professor at SciencesPo and regularly teaches in leading universities around the world, including here at HLS, Pennsylvania, Miami, Wisconsin, Torino, and Puerto Rico. And Professor Alviar is also the co-founder of Justicia, one of the leading human rights NGOs in the Global South. Thank you for joining us. Professor Dr. Malik Dahlan, my own classmate of 01, an internationally recognized lawyer and mediator from Mecca. Professor Dr. Dahlan is the Honorary Professor of Constitutional and Legal Studies at the University of St. Andrews and Emeritus Professor of International Law and Public Policy at Queen Mary University of London. He's also a Fellow of Peterhouse at the University of Cambridge. Malik is a UN constitutional expert who works in various avenues to support international diplomacy, promote energy transition and climate development finance. He pioneered humanitarian refugee programs in Syria and Jordan, focusing on legal challenges related to displacement and reconstruction. Thank you, Malik. Navy Captain Jake Romelhart. This is a new, right? The captain is a new.
26 days, yeah.
Yeah, congratulations. Class of 2014, he currently serves as the Director of National Security Law Division of the U.S. Navy Office of the Judge Advocate General in Washington, D.C. In his illustrious Navy career, he served as legal and policy advisor in the Pentagon, in the U.S. Africa Command, in the U.S. Special Operations Command, the U.S. Naval Forces in Europe and Africa, Carrier Strike Group 15, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Multinational Force in Fallujah, Iraq, and other theaters, both active combat zones and outside of combat zones. Thank you, Jake, for joining us. And last but not least, Venera Ziegler, class of 2000, a native of Sofia, Bulgaria. Ms. Ziegler is a partner in the investment funds group at DLA Piper, advising domestic and international private equity funds. She also regularly advises institutional investors, including pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, in connection with their investment in private funds. She's worked on the sale, restructuring, and acquisitions of multinational investment advisors. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, so a few generic questions to the panel, and then I'll move to more individualized, tailored questions. And so the first generic question is, before you get to HLS, something about the place you grew up in, what it meant for you to become a lawyer, what were the sort of background social and professional norms that led you to thinking about becoming a lawyer? We can do it just by seating order. Malik can start.
Thank you for having me, Gabby. Always a pleasure, and it's a privilege to be part of the 100th celebration, but also, in my view, the best LLM class of HLS, which is the 01 class. 3 HLS professors out of 1 class. So I'm from Mecca, And as you can imagine, this is a place where millions of human beings make their way for Hajj pilgrimage. And they come from absolutely different and diverse backgrounds, and they don't all speak English or Arabic or anything. So you end up sometimes having to gesture and communicate somehow just to keep it going. But also there's this sort of deeper, larger, wider cultural, civilizational, confessional history to that positive place. It's a shared place for worship. So, and it's also a shared place for jurisprudence. So I came with a lot of that in the background that, you know, I descend from a family that's very much connected with jurisprudence in the Holy Mosque in Mecca, which until, 100 years was the oldest university. So yeah, that's what I came here with, but happy to be probed further.
Well, I wanted to thank you for having me here and also in this very distinguished panel that I think I'm like different from the rest of the experiences here, but I'm going to say a bit why I studied law and then why I wanted to come to a place like Harvard. So I actually studied law because when I was around 12, I read To Kill a Mockingbird. And I thought, I want to be this lawyer. I want to be this person who fights for social justice. But, and maybe my fellow Uniandinos here are going to be a bit shocked, but when I studied law, I never heard a conversation about justice. So during those 5 years, the only thing we did was read the text of the law or read a comment to the text of the law, and that was basically it. And never in those 5 years did I hear the word, this is the just outcome of this, or this should be the just outcome of that. It was more of a formalist education, despite the fact that Los Andes has always been a pioneer in many ways. But during those years, it was still a relatively young law school, et cetera. So I longed for two things. I longed for a place where I could listen to a discussion about what law, a more theoretical discussion, what law is, what is it for? Like to give, as I tell my students, to give them tools to face the unknown, not the text of the law that you would memorize or even try to understand, but something that can pull you back. And also I wanted to be challenged. I wanted to understand law in its context, its geographical context, its historical context, et cetera. And also to take, as central questions about social justice. So those were the reasons I came. I think some of the questions were dealt with in class. I would say the social issue questions were less dealt with in class when I came here as an LL.M, probably because of the courses I took, but that's the history of what happened before. Jake?
Hi, good afternoon. Before I begin, I'll give my required disclaimer that the personal insights and experiences I'm about to share are my own and not those of the United States government, the Department of the Navy. I have a good lawyer. So I grew up in Michigan, small town just outside Chicago, but it was very much a community made up of people who were displaced actually by the First World War. And I think growing up in that environment, it gives you a viewpoint of people's respect for the government and the law, and sometimes the distrust of the government and the law. And then I went to law school. Between my 2L and 3L year, I had a nice summer associateship with a big firm in Chicago. I thought it was going to be really comfortable. It seemed a little too adult for me at the time, so I decided to join the Navy on a whim. I was going to be in for 4 years. That was in 2004. And here I am. So I think right before I came here, the Navy sends you here sort of mid-career to specialize. In the 3 years immediately preceding, I think two things will inform you about my experience here is one, I was a lawyer for a SEAL team for the 3 years before. And it was a very active SEAL team, very active in combat operations around the world. And two, I was a gay man, and that in 2000, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell wasn't repealed until the end of 2011. So one of the things in this building, the first classes I had in this building was the Supreme Court seminar with Justice Kagan, where we had discussed the Windsor decision that had just come out that summer. So if you look at it from my perspective, I could have gotten fired for being gay up until the end of 2011, And then the first thing I learned when I came here, or I talked to the justice that wrote the opinion that allowed me to be able to have a husband, and he could get all of the benefits that the military would provide to spouses. And that happened in a very short amount of time. So it was very much a time of awakening for me and kind of cultural whiplash. So.
Thank you for having me here. So my story is very much influenced by the fact that I grew up in communism, really behind the Iron Curtain, with very little knowledge about this part of the world. And when I started studying law is the year that communism fell. And for me, it was a very big inspiration to try to change things in my country. And I had these big dreams how I can help and I can assist with the writing of the Constitution, and I started working for a constitutional law judge. My drive really has been by the fact that growing up in communism, my family was expelled to live in a small town, and my granduncle was killed in 1945 without any court and any due process. So I grew up with that drive to accomplish something more fair for the people that are being raised in, like, continue to live in that country. So when communism fell, I devoted a lot of time on helping people and quickly realized that it is better for me to step out of my comfort zone and see if I can study somewhere else, either in Europe or in the US. And I came to visit my brother, who was at the time in a small city, in a Sioux City, Iowa, actually, of all places. And I told him, I said, look, I want to study law and see what I can do. And here, right, not only studying in Bulgaria. And he's like, girl, you don't speak any English. So I was like, okay, well, I'll learn it. So I sat for 4 months in his college library. I learned English, and I took the tests and applied to a few law schools. Obviously, once I got into Harvard, that was it. And I continued. When I came here, for me, it was a huge shock. Huge shock in terms of cultural shock, shock from legal shock. I also had never told Harvard that my story, because I felt like embarrassed, like that I'm coming from a small country behind the Iron Curtain with a past that for me was a very difficult to share, because I always had to worry who is going to know what and how the communists perceived certain things in time, and it was just dangerous. And so I came here, and it was very big cultural shock how people were very freely expressing their ideas. And evident by this panel, like everybody was from somewhere else. I can answer more questions when you come.
No, this is great. So you started talking about once you arrive here, and maybe you can continue on that theme. For you, the most distinctive thing was that everybody seemed more comfortable in their skin. I think we often talk to students when they arrive here, and I try to assure students as I recount the accomplishment of the class and sort of introduce them to themselves, like all the great talent in the class. And I say, well, you hear me say these things and you immediately feel that you don't belong. There's been some terrible mistake, and that the only reason you're here is some deep oversight on our part, that we somehow threw the applications on the stairwell, and whoever made it top the stair 3 got in, and I tried to assure them, no, it's actually a very rigorous process that has a logic to it, and you're here for a reason. So there is that fear that I think so many people hold of, do I really belong here? Can I match up to the other amazing things that people are capable of? And there was, of course, the language barrier that is a huge thing, right? The huge sense of challenge for people for whom English is not their first language. But then I want to drill down more on the sort of cultural aspects of how people communicate or how people carry themselves. And sort of, if you can say, we'll go this way now, if you can say more about what did you feel was most difficult or challenging for you to sort of step into in that?
Right. I mean, I feel when I came here, the first shock was the cultural differences, right? Everybody, for me, it was the biggest shock was how certain certain cultures feel very freely in expressing their ideas. And especially, I think we're talking about this, we were one of the first classes that was integrated with the S.J.D program. And for me, that was amazing. But sitting there in the classroom where everybody was so free and expressing, going back and forward with the professors and learning everything, having the experience of studying in the US before, that was huge. And for me, it was like, what am I doing here? Like, right? Like, for me, it was very difficult to feel comfortable in that skin. But then I realized very quickly that like a lot of LLMs feel that way. And I also, like, our class became so tight and so close, and my LL.M class became my family to a degree where I still have friendships that I cherish very deeply from that class, and we are a lot of us in touch, and we remain involved in the school programs. And when I go to the reunions in Europe of the association in Europe, like, there's like so many people in my class that are constantly there. But I think, going back to your question, not to stay away on the point, I think it was very, very shocking just to find the steps so that they can lead me to a moment where I can also speak up in class and participate in the Socratic method and how people talk to each other.
So when I showed up here in 2013, I think the two major national security issues people were always talking about were drone strikes and the Edward Snowden revelations about certain US intelligence practices. And in my 3 years preceding that, those intelligence practices and drone strikes were two things that I personally advised on. So showing up here, I was actually overwhelmingly, refreshingly surprised by how professional people were and how deferential they were to experience most of the time. Sometimes I think people were very certain about things they didn't have personal experience with. And I can remember sitting in actually Professor Blum's class, and someone kept calling drone strikes joystick warfare or video game warfare. And it's hard for me not to take that personally. Like, somehow when I'm involved in those targeting decisions, I don't recognize the gravity and the importance of the decisions that we're making. And I know I don't think the person meant any offense by it, but it's still something that I took personally. So I think learning to deal with that was one of the major issues, but also I think there are a lot of really important, still are policy and legal discussions that need to be had around targeted killing. But I think sometimes, and I think this might be somewhere where the US government could be better, is people don't understand exactly the rigor and the processes that go into making those decisions. Sometimes talking to people, I think they think the very junior officer who is flying the remote piloted aircraft is the one making the targeting decisions. And that's really not the case. But I don't fault people in the general public for not knowing that. I think it's something that the American government can do better at doing. So I think those two things kind of illustrate my culture shock when coming here and having discussions about that.
So can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
So you were one of the handful of American LLMs, and as an American LLM, do you feel like you are kind of a translator? Do you have a role? Did you think of yourself as having a role in sort of translating American to the, we often tell LLMs when they come in that they think they speak English, but Americans have a particular kind of English, right? So when they say, how's it going, they don't really mean it. And when they say, see you later, it's not, they don't really mean they'll see you later. Or, you know, all kinds of things where they tell you, I think it's this way. And you say, well, you think or you know, right? It's a very particular kind of language, right? And do you feel in that spot as you're doing some translation work for the different populations, or are you more embedded with the Americans or with the foreign LLMs? How do you navigate your multiple identities at that point?
Yeah, actually, it's funny, I think there was an Atlantic article about a year ago where they had rooms full of people who were English as a second language and very proficient, and they were talking to each other, and they did a comprehension test after that, and everyone had high comprehension. And then they introduced one native English speaker, and everyone else's comprehension goes way, way down. And so I think about that. And I also thought a lot about, and my Navy colleagues who are here now, is like, why did the Navy spend all this money to send me here? And I think I took that as part of my duty, right? To not only represent the Navy and the government to the J.D. class writ large, but also to help, our foreign classmates in the LM program to acclimate it and, get the most out of their LM experience as well.
Did you feel like you had a shared language with other military people, with LLMs who were served in their national forces and kind of spoke military in the way that you would have a...
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I remember there were a few people in my class that were veterans of Afghanistan from their NATO countries, and it was I felt like I had a shared language with them, but also I think sometimes you have to be careful about that because there are very important but subtle differences. So.
Helena, what's surprising when you get to Harvard Law School? In what way differences matter?
So I actually found, and I still find it now when I teach to a group of students that is very diverse, is the curiosity. The idea that there's so many different ways of doing it and of doing, thinking about law or thinking about legal solutions. And the very interesting thing that I learned during my LL.M, and I still think about almost daily, is that something that may work in one context won't work in another one. Or that in one context it's going to have some, dark sides or unexpected consequences that you would never think of. And I think that nuance to difference was something that I learned by being exposed to people from so many different places. But the other thing is that to learn to take a healthy distance from the idea that in countries, for example, in Latin America, which is where I've done most of my academic research, that we need to take a distance from thinking that everything that is done in the United States or in the European system is the best. And actually that there are things that Latin America has done and has done successfully that could be also incorporated or thought about in discussions about law, both in the United States and in Europe. So I would say those two things, meaning understanding that context matters, the nuance that brings from curious dialogue with people who come from diverse backgrounds.
Malik?
Are you happy for me to go as the radical Saudi now?
Go for it.
All right. I really think that there are few moments where we can actually celebrate ourselves as Harvard Law graduates. I know some may disagree, but unlike our, for example, HBS MBA brethrens, we don't get to drop the Harvard bomb in 5 minutes when you sort of speak about the LL.M. I've had the privilege of actually doing 2 other master's degrees at Harvard. One was in government before the LL.M, and one was afterwards in Middle East Studies. Actually, the second one was inspired by interactions, including with Professor Blum, where I decided to study Hebrew. That wasn't something that was immediately available for me, but I realized that going back to the LL.M program, that unlike the JDs, as soon as you arrived, you were exposed to social thinking. And I'm talking about social thinking from a dialectic behavioral sort of analysis. If you're thinking about if you're thinking of psychology, you're immediately exposed you're able to imagine the other people's ideas, their way of thinking, the way you look at yours, examine your ideas versus theirs. And only through that you create the ability, before even critical thinking, you have the ability to imagine and to have the cognitive capacity to engage even with the academic legal toolkit. So what does that mean? You arrive here and all of a sudden the internationalist is born at Harvard without the limitations of worrying about, you know, where do you need to summer, who do you need to clerk for, what are you going to do for the bar? And because Harvard Law School offers such a broad educational opportunity versus the narrow career opportunities that ends up happening, law firm and so on. Not that I didn't do that and I don't support that, but that all of a sudden allows you not just to engage with the brilliance of others, but to understand the plights, to understand the challenges, to understand where the engagement with the law and the rule of law comes from. By the way, this is not something that happens before Harvard and while you're at the LL.M. program. It happens even afterwards when you go back to your own country or engage with some of the more difficult questions that are happening there. For example, I see Lady Arden here. I'm proudly a UK citizen as well and someone who's engaged in the law in the UK. And, you know, in the UK, we celebrate the independence of the judiciary very much. And, you know, I engaged directly there with Lord Wolfe and a lot of the reforms that were done. And guess what? The function of a translator between cultures happened for me as a Saudi who started working in the UK between some of those ideas, even within the common law system. So I like to always say that I'm actually a civil lawyer who's been corrupted by common law twice.
Bernard, is there a difficult moment you remember from your LL.M. here? Something that was a challenging moment where something was lost in translation, that you felt you couldn't communicate well or somebody didn't communicate well, that, you know, was a tough moment to get through? I mean, let's face it, it's a hard year. You come in with either a lot of proficiency or little proficiency in English. For me, it was my first real winter, I have to admit, which was tough. You know, I remember the admission letter I got from Harvard that then advised me to get a real coat. I immediately burst into tears. And within such a small period of time, you're supposed to come in and get acclimated, find housing and classrooms and where to do grocery shopping and think about, you know, S.J.D, yes or no, and summer jobs and all that. And there are moments of tension, right? It would be impossible not to. Is there a moment of tension around something that you think was just about miscommunication or allusions to kind of social and cultural background norms that happened that you can remember?
I mean, I didn't experience some miscommunications like that. I felt that when I came here, I think the biggest challenge was that everything was just such a short amount of time, that strive to get as much as you can from Harvard Law School with that limited amount of time. I think the cultural shock was the biggest challenge for me. Yeah, things were lost in translation, but I wasn't bothered by that. Like I felt like the school was making a very good job to allow you to, and the LL.M. class is so integrated that I never had that particular challenge to experience. I think for me personally, the challenge was that some students were very easily outspoken, and well, now you think of it, one thing that is challenging is sometimes people that come from cultures that it's easy to speak up. Sometimes it was difficult to understand whether there is substance with what they're saying or it's just like talking for the sake of talking. And I think LL.Ms are not like that. And I think when we were integrated in those classes, sometimes you were like, okay, I should be right about this, but it doesn't seem right because this person keeps talking so much about it. So I think that was a challenge I grew to understand and navigate.
So Jake, you alluded to one case which was more about the military, but can you think of other instances of?
Of a challenge? I'm trying to think. I mean, I think it's just more variations on the same thing, on the same theme, is that sometimes this may shock some people in this room. People at Harvard Law School are very strong but wrong about certain things. Like they're very sure in their viewpoint, and I think that I always try to come at things from a position of curiosity and humility, where like I have my experience and I think what the answer is, but I would never not allow room for maybe that I'm wrong, because I think that's the whole reason we're here for an LLM. But I do remember sometimes, and I get why, especially some of the things that I deal with, people get really emotional about. I've sat in people's living rooms and told them that their loved ones aren't coming home, so I get why people get emotional. But I think to earlier points before, I think one of the strengths of lawyers is that we should be able to divorce ourselves from those types of emotions and have legitimate, reasoned arguments or discussions about those things.
Helena?
Yeah, no, I have many challenges. I mean, where should I start? But I think that one of them was, as much as I said I was longing for a theoretical education, that was my biggest weakness when I got here. I didn't have it. So there were things I lost. I couldn't grasp what were they talking about? How was this going on? The other thing is that so I had studied in a school in Bogota, Colombia, that was the American school in Bogota. But that was very different from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Like, Cambridge, Massachusetts was like Mars compared to what I had studied. And so just the culture, I had a child. It was, there was a lot of, in Colombia, the child could play, it was my oldest son, he could play with Disney products, and that wasn't a big deal. Here it was like a sin. You could be sent to, hell for that. So all that cultural dialogue was incredibly difficult for me. And it came as a surprise because I spoke English well, because I had been trained I had gone to school, with US citizens, so I didn't think that would be so hard. And then the last thing I would say that was incredible, and to this day, I think is very difficult, is that academics at Harvard Law School, but I would say in the United States, are very tough. Like, they can say something that is very difficult. You raise your hand, you're trying to answer, which, by the way, I never raised my hand, but in any case, and they come back to you like really strongly. And I came from a culture where a professor wouldn't do that. And I would argue, doesn't do that today. They're not that harsh. They're sometimes like, oh, maybe you could look at it this way, or maybe you could look at it that way. And here I was like, I would get home and I was like, this is like everybody's, sweeping the floor with everybody else. And it's a cultural thing, right? It's about like being a Colombian coming to a place like the United States. So those would be maybe too personal, but
So I hear a lot of things that are about the Colombian interaction with the American school. What about within the cohort?
So within the cohort, of course, there was also, but within the cohort, there seemed to be like more solidarity. Mm-hmm. Like, we're here in this together, and we're facing this, because as you were saying before, and I think that it's something that is painful, but also very interesting. Almost, I would say, everybody I talked to had an imposter syndrome. Like, I'm here, but how did I get, well, some people didn't. But some people, or the people that I was close to, did have this feeling like, oh my God, they made a mistake. Maybe I was, they had this pile and then, right? And so I felt a little bit more solidarity so vis-a-vis, and mostly people who came from Latin America and countries, however you want to turn them, global south. So that's the way I saw it. And I would say, yeah, that's what I would answer.
Malik, a difficult moment?
Many, I think. But, you know, I think as going back to this point about the birth of sort of social thinking, that all of a sudden you're seeing things as the 9 months sort of move, you're starting to see things together. I have 3 points to say about that. I think the first point is that yes, there may be this idea of being Harvard's only mistake as an issue, but I also do think people come here ultimately, they're driven. Everyone has their cross to bear, and they've come here for a reason. And if you look close enough, you'll find it, you'll see it. And once you see it, you'll see the beauty and the brilliance of the people around you. I personally came with a challenge. I came, you know, I wish it was as easy. I came in at a time where the system in Saudi Arabia was very difficult. We had a very sort of autocratic, religious, judicial system that was very hard to engage with, family members being persecuted. And I thought I was the only one who was struggling until I met, you know, colleagues who were smuggled from North Korea to study the LL.M with us, or people who were being literally abused in different ways. And you realize this is a serious place. Yes, we will have fun, but you end up having to think about these issues in a completely different way. The second point was actually arriving to the university. Of course, the law school, many of us have been in different law schools, and a lot of it was very dogmatic. We arrived at a very interesting time, and I go back, I was saying it in the beginning, but I do think 2001 was an interesting year, as it was sort of, it was Y2K was the year before, but the law school itself was just getting out of this whole ideological sort of tension, whether getting out of the critical legal studies movement and what was going there, and also international studies. So we had a grouping, a split, and you either sort of belonged to that set of faculty members or that set of faculty members, and that kind of determined what you're allowed to write about or think or do, which wasn't really comfortable. And I remember I was not, you know, one of those people who wanted to sort of, you know, we had a lot of problems beyond what is being discussed at the law school. I think the moment, and feel free to stop me, Gabby. She has this allowance to kick me under if I'm affecting the mood. I'm stepping out of 10 months of day after negotiations in Gaza, so this is to me fun. Just as we're seeing in the campus, or some of the challenges we've seen last year here and other places, we were right into the second intifada at Harvard, or in the Middle East. But at Harvard, the spaces of expression were not immediately available. We had to figure it out as a group, and these were first-time encounters between Arab students, Muslim students, Saudi students, Israeli students, and we became friends very quickly, and we helped each other have that collective imagination quickly. My biggest advisor and supporter throughout these periods, and people don't know that, including when I have these negotiations, was actually Gabby. How to think about things, how to take things to show a different level of understanding. And it almost became an unwritten sort of code. People like to talk about that in the faculty as an example of what the law school does. But I know in our own ways, we had to deal with these struggles day in and day out, because this is really happening. It wasn't just in the US, it was home. It was everything we knew. But it was up to us to teach ourselves and learn it. And I think, again, tell me if you want me to talk about specific instances, or should I?
So it's less than a comment than, less than a question than an observation, something we talked about just before the panel. So I remember those days very well. And I remember it was super contentious. So, no one else here wanted to talk about stories. But I think both Malik and I have stories about how contentious it got, and people making comments on email, et cetera, et cetera. And I think you made a hugely brave decision, because I mostly remained within the comfort of there's always an Israeli mafia here, every LL.M, and they're a big group, and I think I fairly stayed within that group, and you made a decision early on to sort of cross the lines in the sense of going back and forth, even the decision to learn Hebrew, which you took immediately in the beginning of the LM, very early into the LM, you started learning Hebrew, and it would come and we would joke and you would say a few words in Hebrew here and there. And I thought it was an immensely brave and unusual, and for me, totally surprising, this kid from Mecca, who is so embedded, because we talked about that as well, embedded in the kind of management of the holy sites and the religious aspects of it. And here you are wanting to talk to the Israeli crowd and listen and understand and sort of much more have a conversation than judge. And I was flabbergasted by it. And I think I would love to hear more about sort of, it was very risky for you. It was a very risky move, and sort of what prompted you to decide to test that out in a where you're away from home, you don't have your usual support network, you're gonna have some people turn on you, as was the case, and you decide to do it nonetheless.
Well, you've just reminded me about a lot of these things. But let me start. But I'll take the compliment. But I also say that I was also very fortunate to have a colleague like you, Gabby. I mean, and there was a moment where I remember in one of those instances that I was, directly exposed to challenges with Islamophobia, and the person who sort of came and ran sort of after me to actually sort of say, no, this is not acceptable, was Gabby. We haven't talked about that since then, and but that in itself, that human interaction, the trigger for all of that was also to want to understand what anti-Semitism is and was. And I did not have that context. That was not something that was offered to me where I lived, where I was from, the history of that, the depth of that. It meant that there was a serious gap in understanding the humanity that we here as Harvard lawyers are meant to sort of defend, including for the rule of law and other things. Yes, I didn't think of it as a brave thing, or it just seemed like the right thing to do. Perhaps call it a moral compass, call it, but I guess as part of the questions are stating, I think those are the very tools that helped ultimately today to have these really difficult conversations. And as you know, the normal, the comfortable space, I guess, the expression of this from a doctrinal point of view is negotiations. And this is where you're able to actually engage as a matter of a principled negotiation and approach. I wish we did more of that. I wish that was more streamlined instead of the, hiding behind political correctness and not actually addressing the issues that matter and actually forging these relationships that matter in the long run. And I want to use this moment to say that even though I was meant to be going to New York today, one of the reasons I'm here, and I'm going to use this excuse here on the podium, is to also, I'm starting a campaign because I'm seeing that Gabby is being promoted further and further here at the law school.
That's going to stop you.
And I'm going to insist that we desperately need her in the region to go and run for office and to become the next prime minister of Israel.
I thought you liked me. Okay.
I'm just saying, for the record.
Helena, you taught all over the world, and you taught in leading universities around the world and teach today at a leading university around the world. Is there anything beyond the sort of American versus, is there anything that strikes you as distinct, that is so different, and do you adapt your teaching or thinking in those various institutions, or do you pretty much do your thing, and even if
No.
it's received differently?
No, of course I would say, of course I adapt, because, I mean, I think I'd like to go back to, because I think maybe I didn't speak well or something, but I never thought that it was like the US against the rest of the world, or meaning here in the experience. No, in the experience. I think that for me, the guiding light is curiosity. And so, for example, curiosity and passion, I would say, are the two things. So I taught most of my life in Bogota, Colombia. And the difference there was that for the students, all the questions were about life or death. Because at that time, there was a civil conflict. So it wasn't like the questions were something way out there, very abstract, like it happens in France. In France, they can spend hours and hours speaking about things like, you're like, but why, where, I don't, And so the rawness of the teaching in Colombia, I miss tremendously, because everything, it was about real things that have to do not only with the civil conflict, but also with inequality, with political participation, etc. So I would say, but when I teach in international settings, I can still pick up the passion. So something that I try to do in my classes is to bring something about the world to the classroom. And I bring it either through literature, so I teach a lot of art in my classes, literature, art exhibits, movies, music, things that can bring together even a diverse group of students around basic questions about compassion, about love, about care, etc. So I think that the passion is moved both through the context, but also by bringing us together through art, for example. Now, the passion is one, but curiosity is the other one. Because sometimes you get to a classroom, either, in what is called the global north or the global south, and students are not curious. They're not curious not because there's anything wrong with them, but because they're glued to their phones. And so, and actually professors too. I mean, just one parenthesis, you go to any faculty meeting and professors complain that students are looking at their computers, are looking at their phones, and everybody is looking at their phones too. I mean, I would put the band phone that I have in my classrooms in faculty meetings, but okay, that was a parenthesis. But so the only way you can bridge curiosity is also to try to tell the students, listen, we're here and we're now, and there's something that is happening here for this hour and a half that it has to be magic, that has to open your curiosity. So I would say, yes, I do adapt to each setting, because each setting has a different context, has different needs, has a different political system. But I also try to bring together the issues that I feel, I hate the word universal because I teach in France and it's such a charged world, but I would say things that are common to us. And I do that through art, so that would be my answer.
Jake, I have a question about what the Harvard degree does, for better or worse. So a lot of our students say, I want to go to Harvard because it's the Harvard name, and of course it's the best currency in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But I know from my own personal experience that it's a double-edged sword, in the sense that you come back and you say, I'm now Harvard trained, and people around you say, oh yeah, you think you're smarter than everyone because you're Harvard trained. And there's always this kind of dialectical appreciation, but also a little bit of an aversion or suspicion that people suspect you're trying to be paternalistic or kind of snobbery towards them. Did you notice that going back to the military?
Yeah, absolutely. Like from small respects, like I think I told you before, like every time I make one minor grammatical mistake in an email, it's like, oh, he went to Harvard. Yeah, right. But
I
also,
do it on purpose.
Yeah, I don't know how to conjugate verbs in English, and I'm from Michigan, right? But the other issue is I was the advisor to the commander in charge of all U.S. Special Operations in Africa, and you can read in open source how there are ongoing counterterrorism missions in East Africa and West Africa. And before groups would deploy, so we're talking about Navy SEALs, and enlisted Navy SEALs and enlisted Army Special Forces, my commanding general thought it would be a good idea for me to brief them on Justice Jackson's concurrence in Youngstown Tube and Sheet Company, about the 3 categories of domestic power and how they apply to counterterrorism operations. So you can imagine how receptive a room full of Navy SEALs are when you're coming in to talk about
The twilight zone.
right, the zone of twilight. So I think but I actually think the skills you get as an LLM actually help in that regard, because when you were saying, like, when you have to translate, I think you get really good at tailoring your message to your audience, and I think that's something that I got from Harvard. I would never tell those people that, but I think you get really, if you're dealing with people who are maybe have a different proficiency in language or come from a different culture, you get very attuned to like looking at their faces and see if what you're saying is sinking in. And so I think that's actually my Harvard experience is what sort of combats the Harvard stigma in those situations.
Great. And our last question for me before I turn it to our audience. So you work with high-level domestic and international investors, and I used to teach here international negotiations, and there was always a question when you taught kind of cross-cultural dialogue. There is a way in which, all of us have a bunch of different cultures, right? It's where we came from originally, our profession, our education. And I wonder, in your professional dealings today, how much do you still see that where people come from or still matters, or whether we basically breathe through our, education system or professional environments, that everybody gets acculturated to becoming more or less the same person who speaks the same kind of professional language, who dresses in a particular way? How much do differences still matter in your work? And if they do, to the extent they do, how do you navigate that?
I don't dress in a particular way. That I keep. I agree with you. There is still that there is a big value in when representing investors, in understanding their cultural background and bringing that to the table. I did take the negotiation workshop, and I thought that was a fantastic experience, and it did help me get to that point where Getting to Yes was a big was a huge book for me to read at the time. I think you learn with time, and I think the Harvard experience for me was very important in terms of understanding everyone's cultural background and not taking a view whether or not someone is right or wrong, or whether there is a particular majority presented in a school, a minority. It taught me to understand every group's different dynamics and their disadvantages and the human condition, actually, like where they come from and what they've suffered. So I think when you work with that in mind, I work with Canadians. Canadians have they don't prefer, they're not litigious. They would never go and litigate the way US investors would just go to court anytime. You also have to be very polite in certain circumstances dealing with other cultures. So I do think that the Harvard experience has given me that, and it has helped me. It helped me with that and helped my curiosity and my patience and empathy for every person in the room, for where they come from and what they suffered in life and how they present themselves on the business table.
Great. I would love now to hear from the audience. If you guys have questions, and there'll be mics, I think, right? Are there mics? There are mics. Okay. Any questions or comments? I think you want
Can
to.
I say something
Yes,
about the
absolutely.
stigma?
Yes.
Because I find that a really interesting thing. There is no doubt in my mind that the most important thing in my life, professionally, was coming to Harvard. But it wasn't, so I always felt like I came here being one person. I went back to Colombia 5 years later, and I always felt like I was more or less the same person, like, you know, just 5 years older. But having the Harvard name was a complete different, I mean, so I went back to Colombia in the year 2001. There were not that many women in academia. There were, you know, it made a difference. It made a huge difference. And I didn't feel a stigma, I think, or I never felt, yeah, I always felt that it was, I mean, I have a distance, of course, I have a distance with many things about Harvard Law School, of course. I mean, I think all of us do. And I think that the world doesn't start and end at Harvard. I think there is a world out there of things that happen to people all the time. But I do think that it made, like, I wouldn't have achieved many things in life, even though I felt like, again, the same person, but I would have not achieved them professionally if I hadn't come here. It just made a life-shattering difference, and I'd like to, I've never experienced, I'm not celebrating, I don't think this is a perfect place, no place is perfect, but it did make a very big difference for me.
It is perfect.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in what sense is it not perfect?
I had a very similar experience when I returned to Peru. I spent here, I had an extra long LL.M. here. I stayed here for the LL.M. and then for the S.J.D. courses and the thesis, but I never got to present the thesis. But so I spent like 3 years here. And it was like a seal of approval planted in my forehead where you're presumed competent unless you prove otherwise.
Exactly.
That's a big break in life. That for me that was a life-changing experience.
Yeah, totally.
So that's on the upside. You were asking about the problems during the LM. I will alert the LLMs who are here now who are not familiar with short days in the winter. That affected me tremendously. I almost had I was depressed in December, January, and then when I was working in Washington, I went to see a doctor who happened to be the specialist in seasonal affective disorders, SAD. Then I understand what it was, and then I found the cure for it, by the way. There's light boxes that you can get, and get only half an hour a day. My son has the same thing, and he got one day 3 hours. He said, "Dad, I'm completely wired." He said, "No." So you need to be careful.
Yes, there is a reason why we scheduled this for September and not for November.
But you have to alert them, the seasonal affective disorder.
We'll make sure to add it to the application packet. Over there in the back. In the back, over there.
Thank you for an excellent panel. Just by way of introduction, my name is Nils Ivars. I'm from Sweden, and I graduated 2 years ago from the LL.M. And actually something that Professor García mentioned here that made me thinking, you were saying, and I don't want to quote you because I might recall wrong, but something along the lines of understanding that also Europe and the US and elsewhere can learn something from your region and in terms of law. And that made me think about an experience I had during my year. I had the huge privilege and honor of being class marshal during my year, which was perhaps the greatest honor of my life, honestly. And one challenge in doing that and trying to bring the entire class together was, of course, to being aware of including everyone's culture. And given that this panel is about culture, I wonder if you had that experience too. And as an example, we had in the fall an activity which might have violated 1 or 2 COVID policies, but nevertheless, we had an apartment crawl where we organized the class, those who wanted to come to different apartments, and every apartment had a different country theme. And after that event, which was a big success, people came up to me and said it was great, but did you think about the fact that it was only European countries and I think a few Latin American countries that stepped forward and had, for lack of a better word, the cultural pride or confidence in saying, I want to show off my culture, I want to invite you to come here. And that made me think, of course, for me as a Swede, it felt natural to invite everyone to sing ABBA and whatever we did. But maybe that was not so easy for people from other cultures and perhaps from the global south or elsewhere. So my question to the panelists, A, is this something you recognize? And with a few more years under the belt in your professional careers, how have you managed that cultural pride or cultural self-confidence, for lack of a better word, in your careers? And is that something you see? Thanks.
Anyone who wants to address that?
I could say that I saw it in stark reality when I was at U.S. Africa Command, because during the last French presidential election, I went up to the headquarters for the French Ministry of Defense. We call it the hexagon. I don't know if French people call it that, but it looked like a hexagon from the ceiling, or from the sky. And we were talking about French counterterrorism operations in West Africa. And we were there with Malians and people from Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. And you can see that the West African countries are very much watching the US representatives about how we interact with the French, because their relationship with the French in West Africa is very complex. And I think had we gone into those situations where we only looked at it as a French-American bilateral discussion, I think we would have lost some of the support from the nations that are actually dealing with the terrorist threat in West Africa, and those are the countries that we all need support from. So I think that was a very eye-opening part of what you were saying. Like, I think you have to be very, because I also went to a conference in The Hague where it was sort of the littoral West African countries and the Dutch people the Dutch organization that threw this conference was like, we need to be very careful about seeming like we're neo-colonialists, but I'm like, well, we're meeting in The Hague, and this whole conference is in French and English, so it's kind of hard to tell the representative from Benin that this isn't like a remnant of colonization, right? To your other point, I think I'm not really a touchy-feely, or I don't consider myself naive, but you can hear like everyone on this panel, they talk about just values, and what are we saying instead of universal? Common values, right? But it's like empathy, curiosity, compassion, humility. I think those go a long way in bridging any type of cultural difference, because we're gonna all get it wrong, right? It's just how you react when you get it wrong, I think, that matters.
So can I say something quickly about the culture? Because I think that is something, so I've thought about that so much as a person who came to the United States for a few years to study, lived in Colombia the majority of her life, and now moved to France. And I always thought, well, I have the tools. I mean, how complicated can it be to go to France? I mean, the French, they have their tradition. I had read about their history. But actually, cultural differences are much more profound than one can think of initially, right? They go beyond reading a book about history or even speaking the language. They are much more robust in a way. And I think that being always curious and always, but beyond curious, being aware that the cultural bridge is very difficult to navigate. It's not that easy, right? Even when you are in cultures that seem to be, the French had some influence in Latin America. We have their civil code, but there are many, many profound cultural differences, and you have to be aware that the bridge isn't that easy to cross, or it's not that short.
You wanted to answer? No? Lady Arden.
It's been a very interesting session. Thank you, everybody, very much. But I'd just like to ask a slightly different question, and that is, how do people on the panel refresh their memories of Harvard and their relationship with Harvard after they've left? Is there some tip they could give us? Do they read the Harvard Law Review? Do they read the Harvard Bulletin? Do they have a WhatsApp group with their year? It would just be interesting to know the various ways, because while we all come away with very strong impressions and very strong learning experiences, how do we keep up to date with Harvard? How do we follow you?
I find speaking on a panel is very useful.
Yes.
So you can get involved in the local club, or like, we have a New York Alumni Association. Most major cities have alumni associations. You can get involved on the board. You can gradually get involved on the Alumni Association at the school, on the executive committee, etc. I particularly stay very close to the European Association, to the New York Association, and we welcome any help, and people volunteer their time, and you meet so many interesting people, not only LLMs. Like, it's been an incredible experience to be on the board, and we're very, very active. So.
And Lady Arden, this morning I mentioned world class, and world class was designed. I hope you're getting world class. So this is an unfortunate thing that we need to correct. But what we've noticed is that people tend to have yearly WhatsApp groups, and they connect on emails or WhatsApp, and they do it by year of graduation. So if you graduated it in 2001, you were in very close touch with the class of 2001, but you had no idea who was there in 2000 or 2002. Right? And that just seemed like a terrible missed opportunity. And so we now have this digital e-newsletter that comes out twice, 3 times a year. You will get one after this event with some highlights. And it's really designed to have a cohort of graduates of the graduate program, LLMs and S.J.Ds from all years, and we feature people who do amazing things. We have an announcement section for people who want to tell us what they're doing or want to connect with one another over various joint ventures. And for us, it's a very important move, precisely in the direction you're alluding to, of sort of how do we all keep this going after the end of the gala tomorrow night.
Well, thank you very much. I should stress that I did get an email, but I didn't think it was called world class. And the bulletin obviously comes, which I thoroughly enjoy.
No, we're not the bulletin. It's a different operation.
All right. I just wanted to say that although it may be true that in American cities, the local Harvard Law Association works well, I don't know what Professor Malik Dahlan finds, but it's moribund in the UK.
This is the point on the how we respect the judiciary in the UK. I was hiding from it because at some stage I was the secretary of the HLSA UK. And Sir Bernard Ricks presided over that for a long time. So we had a long time. But I believe it's been reformed. And I know that the international section is taking a serious lead. In fact, Henrik Lundberg, another 01 graduate. See, there's a conspiracy there with 01 graduates are taking a lead. But I think the HLSA UK is now dealt with. I think I took the position that we needed to safeguard intergenerational equity and push it over to the next generation. But thank you for the reminder.
We do call different cities and whomever volunteers. The clubs have been started to reestablish. London is very active, and the European Association of Europe is also very active. There is a yearly reunion every year in Europe where Harvard Law School students come.
I'm going to say a quick anecdote because I found that very funny. One of my first functions to sort of manage between HLSA proper here and HLSA UK was the big debate about having our first event there was whether or not at the Inns of Court we were going to use the 12th century silver or not. And HLSA proper didn't think that mattered at all, but it was a very big deal for us in the UK.
Apropos cultural differences. That's all we have time for. Please join me in thanking our panelists.